German Chancellor will not budge on is the principle of free movement within the European Union. She's made that clear, and indeed Mr Cameron changed the draft of his speech a couple of months ago on this very issue. What I expect to see are some cosmetic concessions, perhaps the Germans agreeing that maybe child benefit should not be paid to children living in other parts of Europe. But even if Mr Cameron later on today stands on the steps of Downing Street and says this is a great victory, it still won't work because the polls have made it clear they will veto it anyway. I do not believe that the British people can be bought off with anything less than the red line of us being able to control who does and does not come into our country. And unless the British Prime Minister can get a concession on the free movement of people, I do not believe in a referendum the British people would vote for us to remain members. I think that even the Germans and the European Central Bank are now beginning to realise that it's politically impossible for Greece to remain members of the euro. So they are preparing themselves for the first member to break away and comforting themselves that if it's Greece, that's fine. It'll just be Greece and nobody else. You only have to look at what is happening in Spain and in Italy, with very large protest movements, with now half of the voters in Italy voting for parties that want to leave the euro or want a fundamental renegotiation of their terms, to understand that the euro is doomed. And thank goodness we didn't listen to many in Westminster, and we didn't join.
Well, joining me now is the UKIP leader, Nigel Farage. I mean, let me put it to you, this is all just a bit of pre-referendum negotiation. Mrs Merkel just setting out her position.
There is no negotiation. You know, I've spent over 15 years in the European Parliament, working in Brussels, and I can tell you there is a unanimity of view that these treaties are not to be unpicked in any way at all, and that the free movement of people is considered to be one of the most important elements of the European Union. The only country in Europe in which our politicians pretend there can be an a la carte menu is here in Britain, in Westminster. It's not possible. And so Mr Cameron was pushed, I think, by UKIP's success in Clacton into extending his renegotiating position into saying we should renegotiate free movement. It isn't going to happen.
But let me put it to you, this is all bluff. At the end of the day, Germany would be deeply reluctant to see Britain leave the EU because it wants a country of similar political outlook inside the European Union. So they don't want us to leave.
My experience of Brussels politics is that the Germans don't bluff. They're very straightforward. They really do say what they think. And Mrs Merkel would rather Britain left the European Union than those treaties started to be unpicked. Once that process begins, the European project is finished, and she knows that.
We hear now, though, that Mr Cameron may try a different sort of approach, trying to stretch the existing rules as far as they possibly could go, saying perhaps that EU migrants coming here would have to have a job. Now, he could get a deal on that.
Mr Cameron will try and fiddle around at the edges. What he will not be able to do is to change the basic principle that nearly 500 million people, if they want, can come to this country. That isn't going to change. He'll fiddle around the edges and actually finish up satisfying neither side.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tericabras. Now for 3 minutes we have Mr. Farage.
We're embarked upon a course of almost unbelievable stupidity. The historic error made by Chancellor Merkel last year by saying all can come has led directly to this mess. And now we're being blackmailed by Turkey. First they came for 3 billion in a promise to reduce the numbers coming in to Greece and the rest of Europe. And of course, when the numbers increased many-fold, they came back for another 3 billion. And they will keep on coming back for more and more and more. As the British poet Rudyard Kipling observed of the Danish incursions into England. And that is called paying the Danegeld. But we proved it again and again that if once you have paid him the Danegeld, you'll never get rid of the Dane. And now they've got us over a barrel. This new deal, where for every one illegal migrant we send back, if our human rights laws allow it, they'll send us another one back from Syria. So the argument is, we paid them a fortune not to reduce numbers, and yet we've given in and we've said visa-free access for 75 million Turks from June of this year. In theory, they can stay for 90 days. In practice, many will disappear or, of course, claim family reunion. The numbers will go sharply up. And in return for all of this, we're now going to fast-track Turkey as a full member of the European Union. My goodness me, I wish that David Cameron was as good at negotiations as the Turks are. So we're going to go into political union with a country that's got borders with Iraq, Iran and Syria. We're going to go into political union with a country that is poorer than anybody else in the European Union and give free movement for 75 people, and join up with a government that is increasingly Islamist and authoritarian. The Turkish Prime Minister said this week, Turkish membership will be a turning point. Too right. The British Prime Minister has long supported Turkey being a member of this union. In fact, he's fought hard over 10 years for them to join. He doesn't bat an eyelid at the extra £500 million we will stump up to help fund this crisis. Well, this referendum in Britain is all about what is the safest option. And given that the boss of Europol says already there are 3,000 to 5,000 Islamist terrorists that have come into Europe using the migrant routes, it's pretty clear to me that a vote to remain is a vote for Turkey. A vote to remain is a vote for massively increased immigration into Britain, and a vote to remain is a vote that makes Britain more vulnerable to terrorism. Safer to vote to leave and take back control of our borders. Thank you.
Now, the German leader lost a crucial vote over the weekend. Her party is due to have the same fate next weekend. Similar populist rages are building in Portugal and Italy and France. And some are calling it a Donald Trumpian rage, that the world is going the way of let's protect our borders, something that has been a cornerstone of former UK Independence Party leader Nigel Farage, who joins us right now. Nigel, good to have you.
Good to be here and welcome back.
And thank you for your very kind note, Nigel. I appreciate that. Let me ask you about what's going on here, because there's something in the global well, not just in the United States, but you've astutely picked up on this trend years ago, whether people agree or disagree with you. But I think the Merkel pounding jeopardizes her very leadership, and for that matter, the German leadership of Europe. What's going on?
Well, let's get a sense of context here. I mean, there's been opposition growing over the course of the last few years to the whole direction that global politics, global corporate politics, has been going in. And what Brexit has done is to give inspiration to absolutely everybody who believes in nation-state democracy, controlling their borders and putting the interests of their own people first. And I see, a big parallel with what's happening in Germany with Brexit, but equally, I was over a couple of weeks ago in Jacksonville, Mississippi. I was at that Trump rally, and I met those people afterwards, and those people in Mississippi felt exactly the same as the people who voted for Brexit and the people who came out and gave Angela Merkel such a bloody nose at the weekend. What we're asking for is portrayed by the international media elites and business elites and political elites as if we're bad people advocating something extreme and dangerous. We're not. We're asking for normality, and normal countries control their borders and look after their citizens.
That does seem to be the trend, but it does invite the wrath of the United Nations, the human rights chief recently slamming you and Donald Trump for using what they've been calling ISIS-style propaganda. What do you make of that?
Well, do you know what, Neil? I've been called many things over the years. A lot of them I wouldn't want my mum to hear. But no one's ever compared me to ISIS. And it shows the level of desperation these over-bloated, paid international bodies are sinking to. They see Brexit as the first brick in the wall. They will now do anything to stop Donald Trump. And remember, they try to stop Brexit by using Project Fear. They're now going to use the same tactics against Trump in this campaign.
Real quickly, the polls in Germany over the weekend did not look like Merkel's party would lose by the magnitude it did, much as the Brexit polls were very different than the final results. I suspect people, when they're polled on a subject, do what they think is politically correct or say what they think is politically correct and vote otherwise. And I'm wondering if that is a trend we see happening again and again in Europe, and I suspect maybe in the United States.
Well, you're right. Firstly, people sometimes are reluctant to tell pollsters how they will really vote. But here's the other point. The polling industry is now virtually bankrupt because what they can't measure are non-voters who get back engaged with the process. 2.5 million people turned out on the 23rd of June, helped us have our Independence Day and win that Brexit referendum. No one thought it would happen. The bookmakers, the experts, the commentariat, the pollsters. And I just have this feeling in my water that what has happened in the last fortnight in the USA is that the Trump campaign now has the big M. It's got momentum behind it. And I met those people in Jacksonville after the rally. Many of them had never voted in their lives. And I would say to the commentators in America and globally, and our friends who've abused me today at the United Nations, you're in, I think now, for a very big shock.
It's already evidencing itself in one part of the world, and 4 other countries that are looking at the same type of regional elections that could change the face of Europe. Nigel, thank you very, very much.
One event has woken people up to the folly of EU leaders, the Juncker Common Asylum Plan, the Merkel call, which led to a stampede. Those of us that have warned that unlimited numbers of people from different cultures without security checks would pose a threat to the cohesion of our societies were roundly abused for doing so. And then we came to New Year's Eve. Munich. The train station, the main station, closed down because of a terrorist threat, the intelligence coming from Syria and Iraq. The very same train station that in September people had stood at, holding up their placards, refugees welcome. That irony was not lost on me. But it's what happened, I think, in Cologne, where we saw the mob. Up to 1,000 young males in the street, sexually assaulting and harassing women. It is, I think, in many ways, one of the most disgraceful public order events that we've seen in modern day Europe. And yet there was an attempt by the police and the press to cover it all up, and even the suggestion from some German politicians that German young women should change their dress and their mode of behaviour in the street, which I thought was a total insult. There's even a name for these assaults. A name for these assaults in Egypt because they've now become commonplace and part of everyday life. And we ought to have the courage to send out a message to say these assaults must never be acceptable in any European town or city, and we'll do our damnedest to make sure that it never happens again. Now we go to the next European summit, and Mr. Cameron's going to conclude his renegotiation. I've no doubt there'll be a compromise on the fairly minor issue of migrant benefits. I've no doubt that he will come back from that summit with a few promissory notes for the future about Britain's relationship. But what he's not going to be talking about is our ability to get back control of our borders. And the British people know that those young men in Cologne, in a few years' time, will have EU passports and be free to come to Britain. And just to give you an idea of how big the sea change has been, a Daily Telegraph commentator, Alison Pearson, who had said she was undecided on Brexit, she didn't have enough information, wrote this the other day. She said, after Cologne, the EU referendum is about nothing less than the safety and security of British women. We, the Euro clueless, need to woman up and vote for the right of our daughters and granddaughters to live as they choose and to smile in the street. No more Mrs. Don't Know, let's get the hell out. I hope 2016 is our year of deliverance.
Farage?
Mr. Farage has the floor.
Thank you. Look, nobody in their right minds would not agree that it was a sensible thing to do to get France and Germany together round the table to break bread with each other, to have a trade deal with each other back in the 1950s, and to work as sovereign democratic nations together for peace. All of that was absolutely right and high-minded. Sadly, the whole thing has become corrupted. Tony Blair said, the EU today is no longer about peace, it is about power. And how right he was, and how that power has shifted. When Kohl and Mitterrand came here, representing their countries 25 years ago, it was a partnership of equals, but no longer. France is now severely diminished, trapped inside a currency, frankly, from which she can't recover. And the French voice in this relationship and in Europe is little more now, frankly, than a pipsqueak. We're living, and it's an irony, isn't it, that a project that was designed to contain German power has now given us a totally German-dominated Europe. Just look at the euro. Germany has a currency that is undervalued by 20%. A growing and massive trade surplus, and most growth in the German economy since the collapse of 2008 has indeed been in exports to other Eurozone countries, such as your very big arms sales to countries like Greece. And when we have a general election that says a country like Greece wants to change direction, well, I'm sorry, but that now must be brushed aside because the Germans don't want it. And what must count as perhaps the worst piece of public policy seen in modern Europe for half a century, when you compounded the already failing and flawed EU common asylum policy by saying to the whole world, please come to Europe. And we saw, frankly, virtually a stampede. And we learn that 80% of those that are coming are not Syrian refugees. In fact, what you've done is to open the door to young, male, economic migrants, many of whom, I have to say, behave in a rather aggressive manner, quite the opposite to what you would ever expect to see from any refugee. And yet when that failure is met by objections from countries like Hungary, their opinions are crushed. This isn't a Europe of peace, it's a Europe of division. It's a Europe of disharmony. It's a Europe that is a recipe for resentment. And yet, faced with all this failure, both of you said the same thing today. You said Europe isn't working, so we must have more Europe, more of the same failing. Well, there is, I think, a bright star on the horizon. It's called the British referendum. And given that none of you want to concede Britain the ability to take back control of our own borders, a Brexit now looks more likely than at any point in modern time. And I hope and pray that Britain voting to leave the European Union will be the beginning of the end of a project, however noble its original intentions, has gone rotten. Is more of the same. More of the same. And indeed, I met the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, about 18 months ago to talk about this. Now, it's a very odd thing, but I find myself as one of the 7 leaders of a group in the European Parliament. And this means they have to invite me to all the official functions, which is something that I enjoy very much more than they do. So I was at this lunch, and the German Chancellor was there, sitting across the table, and I can let you into a little secret about Angela Merkel, that in private, she's even more miserable than she looks in public. And I said, Chancellor, wouldn't it be a liberation for the German taxpayer, who's just spent 20 years paying for the reintegration of Eastern Germany back into Western Germany? Wouldn't it be a liberation for them not to have to sign blank checks in perpetuity to the Club Med countries? And really, wouldn't your own voters be happier with that situation? And wouldn't it for the Greeks be a chance of salvation to leave the euro, to have a massive competitive devaluation, to write off much of their debt, to regain their democracy, and to try and trade their way back to profitability, much in the same way that Iceland has done since 2008. Oh no, Mr. Farage, she said. Greece must not be allowed to leave the euro, because if Greece leaves the euro, other countries will leave too, and that will be the end of our European dream. Well, there is a bit of me that says I'll drink to that, I suppose. But what she's really saying, and what Mr. Barroso is saying, and what Mr. Herman Van Rompuy, I can never quite keep a straight face when I mention his name, but what they're saying is, whatever the social cost, whatever the economic cost, we must continue with the project. And in maintaining this project, what they have done is they have literally stripped out all forms of democracy from those countries. Greece is now run by a troika, Representatives from the European Commission, the European Central Bank and the IMF, once a fortnight, fly into Athens airport, go and see the Greek Prime Minister and tell him what tax rates must be, what spending can be. All democracy is gone. In fact, it even got so bad that a couple of years ago, when the Greek Prime Minister suggested a referendum on staying in the euro, within 48 hours, the bully boys of Brussels had removed him and replaced him with a puppet. And the same thing happened in Italy too. You know, this is really very, very worrying. The economics isn't working, and therefore the logic is, let's destroy nation-state democracy and let's place all the power that we can at the centre. Well, I think that is damn dangerous, because surely the whole point about democracy is, however much we may dislike the government that's in power, what we do is we battle for another party with a different manifesto to take over and institute new policies. It's called parliamentary democracy.
I have expressed a very strong opinion about Angela Merkel on this program here in America. My opinion is this: I think she ruined Europe. I think she changed Europe forever without asking anybody else in the European Union. Am I coming on too strong, Nigel?
No, you're not. Here's the irony. The European project, when it was founded back in the 1950s, was designed to contain Germany. You know, we've had two disastrous world wars caused by the Germans, and the idea is that the club would contain Germany so that Germany could not become the powerful, dominant force. And it is now a German-dominated Europe, and whether it's the Eurozone and the miseries in the Mediterranean with youth unemployment rates running in some countries at over 50%, or what she did last July, when she said, as many migrants that want to cross the Mediterranean and come to Europe, you're all welcome. And she was doing that not just on behalf of Germany, but actually on behalf of the whole of the EU. I think it was the biggest policy failure we've seen in the Western world for many, many decades.
Look, Europe's going to have to handle, but they're going to have riots in Germany. What's happening in Germany, I always thought Merkel was like this great leader. What she's done in Germany is insane. It's insane. They're having all sorts of attacks. They're having letting in that many people. What they should do is the countries should all get together, including the Gulf states, who have nothing but money. They should all get together and they should take a big swath of land in Syria and they should do a safe zone for people so that they could have a safe where they could live. And then ultimately go back to their country, go back to where they came from.
Does the U.S. get involved in making that safe?
I would help them economically, even though we own $19 trillion. What I won't do is take in 200,000 Syrians who could be ISIS. John, I've been watching this migration, and I see the people. I mean, they're men. They're mostly men, and they're strong men. These are physically young, strong men. They look like prime-time soldiers. Now, it's probably not true, but where are the women? You see some women, you see some children, but for the most part, I'm looking at these strong men. So you ask two things. Number one, why aren't they fighting for their country? And number two, I don't want these people coming over here. And even on a humanitarian, you know, when I was first asked this question, you asked it to me a long time ago, when they were talking about 3,000 people, I begrudgingly would say, oh, maybe, I don't know, maybe.
Letting them into the United States.
A little bit. Then they said 10,000. I'm not thrilled, but maybe. 200,000 people. This could be the greatest Trojan horse. This could make the Trojan horse look like peanuts if these people turned out to be a lot of ISIS.